afternoon, everyone. Good evening. On what feels like the first actual day of winter in New Jersey. My name is Megan Rabine. I am the Director of the Institute for Women's Leadership and the Dean of Douglas Residential College. Welcome to the Anita Ashok Datar Lecture on Women's Global Health. We're very pleased you could join us today. And as you have seen, the creation of a lecture in Anita's name is a fitting tribute for her life, for her passion for women's health and the causes that guided her leadership during her lifetime. This lecture draws to campus groundbreaking pioneers, researchers, field workers, and activists to explore growing international health challenges and the vital role that leaders, particularly women, play from across the globe in addressing them. Tonight you'll hear from two women that exemplify this. I'm very much looking forward to your conversation. I'd like to particularly welcome members of Anita's family today. David Garten, who sits on the board of the Institute for Women's Leadership, Dr. Sanjeev Datar, Meghana Gajal, and other family members that have joined us today. I'd also like to acknowledge our longtime partners in this lecture, Rutgers Global and the Innovation, Design, and Entrepreneurship Academy, who have helped to make this possible. And I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the staff of the Institute for Women's Leadership, who does all of it. Not me, they do all of this. We have many partners and advocates on and off campus who have continued to play a role in elevating the causes of women's leadership. And although I didn't see her before now, but I see her, I'd also like to acknowledge Dr. Rebecca Mark, the former director of the Institute for Women's Leadership, who's joined us today. It's my great pleasure to introduce Kaya Takar, a junior in the School of Arts and Sciences and a Douglas Residential College student majoring in cell biology and neuroscience. As a leadership scholar with the Institute for Women's Leadership, Kaya co-founded Mamas and Melodies, a social action project that uses music therapy to support postpartum mental health and build community among mothers in New Brunswick. On campus, Kaya conducts neuroscience research in 2 labs, where she studies neural circuits underlying emotion, motivation, and cognitive control. Beyond research, she works as a medical assistant at a primary care clinic and tutors at a nonprofit organization where she supports patient care and academic mentoring. Kaya is passionate about health equity and literacy and is actively working towards making healthcare more accessible to underprivileged communities. After graduation, she hopes to pursue an MD PhD, combining her interests in neuroscience, women's health, and global health equity to improve outcomes. Please join me in welcoming Kaya, who will introduce our speakers, as well as our speakers to the stage.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Dean Rabine, and good evening to everyone here today. I'm so glad everyone could make it, considering how cold it is outside. My name is Kaya Tucker, and it is an honor to welcome you all today to this lecture. This year's theme, From Moments to Movements, Making Change from the Grassroots, feels especially timely. It asks us to think about where real change begins. We hear the word change a lot. We see big moments, revolutions, declarations, grand gestures, but when you really think about it, change doesn't usually begin at those big moments. It starts in smaller ways, with people who notice that something isn't working, who care enough to do something about it, and who keep going even when it gets hard. That's the essence of grassroots change. It's not built overnight or led by one person alone. It's built through collaboration, through community, trust, and an unshaken belief and persistence that collective effort can move our world forward. And I believe that that's what this lecture really celebrates: the people and the communities who keep showing up, who keep finding ways to turn care into action, and who remind us that real progress comes from the ground up. As a Douglas student and a leadership scholar with the Institute for Women's Leadership, I've gotten to think a lot about what leadership, activism, and change actually looks like, and what it means to be a leader and make an impact, especially as women, as feminists, where we've had to fight harder to create our own space and to have our voices heard. One of the biggest things I've learned is that leadership isn't about titles or power. It's about awareness, empathy, and responsibility. At the IWL, we talk a lot about what it means to use your voice responsibly, to understand the impact of your choices, to lead with integrity, and to recognize that progress is most meaningful when it's inclusive. That's why I'm especially honored to be introducing our two speakers here today. Women whose work has not only changed lives, but has redefined what leadership and activism can look like on a global scale. Leymah Gbowee is a Nobel Peace Prize Laureate, a Liberian peace activist, and a women's rights advocate who helped end Liberia's second civil war through a powerful grassroots women's movement. She mobilized thousands of Christian and Muslim women in a time of deep division and violence to demand peace and accountability from their leaders. Her movement helped end the conflict and contributed to the election of Africa's first female president. Beyond that historic achievement, Leymah has continued to advocate globally for women's inclusion in peace building and post-conflict recovery. She founded the Gbowee Peace Foundation, Africa, and her memoir, Mighty Be Our Powers, has inspired countless people around the world. Her work reminds us that peace is built through courage and community. Our second speaker, Yifat Susskind, is the Executive Director of MADRE, an international women's and human rights organization that works with grassroots women's groups across the globe. Under her leadership, MADRE has addressed some of the most urgent issues of our time, including gender-based violence and reproductive justice, to climate resilience and humanitarian aid in conflict zones. Yifat's approach is remarkable because it's grounded in partnership. Rather than imposing top-down solutions, she focuses on supporting the people that are already leading change in their own communities, ensuring that the ones that are the most affected by inequality are the ones shaping the response. She's written and spoken widely on how global movement can be reimagined through a feminist, community-based lens, and she has been featured everywhere from the United Nations to major international publications. And honestly, I could say so much more about the accomplishments of these wonderful women. Their achievements, awards, and influence are far greater than I can capture in a short introduction. But what I think stands out the most is the way that they live their values, the way that they've turned conviction into consistent and collective action. As we listen to their stories today, I hope we think about how those lessons can apply to our own lives, how we can take small, purposeful steps that contribute to something much larger than ourselves. It's truly my honor to welcome Leymah Gbowee and Yifat Susskind.
Thank you, Kea, and thank you, everybody, for being here this afternoon instead of in your cozy homes under a blanket. It's really nice to have the chance to be in conversation with you. Leymah, always a pleasure to be in conversation with you. But it's also really an honor to be here as part of the Anita Ashok Datar memorial lecture series. Anita, I think we all recognize as somebody who dedicated her work and her life to making the world a better place. And in moments like the one we are living in right now of great turmoil and violence and transition, she gives us the opportunity, I think, to look at the example of her life in order for us to figure out what we need to do with our lives and where we need to go. And reminds us, I think, that we have the possibility of doing our work, our life's work, in a political tradition that so many amazing people came before us and kind of charted that path. And part of what we get to do in this world is embrace that legacy that Anita and so many others have given to us, and to live it and transmit it, right? That's what is our maybe greatest responsibility and privilege as people in this world. So thank you for taking a little bit of time just to kind of like be there in this moment with us, and to think about that, and to think about her and what we need to do now. What is our job in this moment in the world? It's a big question, and luckily nobody needs to figure it out alone because we're here together. Leymah, I feel like you are somebody who, very much like Anita, has dedicated your life to making this the world that you want to live in, not the world that we have. And you know, as Ko was saying, you are known all over the world for the leadership role that you played in ending your country's civil war. Tell us a little bit more about that, and about what lessons you feel like that experience has for today.
Thank you, Yifat, and thank you all so much for having me. I mean, when we had lived in 14 years of the worst forms of violence, I think till today, people really do not understand the depth of what we went through in Liberia. For a nation to be able to wipe out almost 10% of her population, that is something small group of people, but 10%, and in some of the most violent ways. When we started the movement, I think basically we were trying our hand at just getting relief. You know, sometimes during the war, I had cried so much that I could not produce enough tears. So in those moments, we're going to die anyway. But let the narrative not be that we did not try. So that was the drive behind the work that we started doing. And when you are not afraid to die, you take chances. So every morning we woke up, we did different things. We didn't have any master's degree in strategic peace building. We were leading from our hearts. We were moving and doing stuff that we felt was important for that day. And we knew that the strategy today may not be effective tomorrow. So we're open to trying anything, from walking to speaking to fasting to praying, just about anything to do to draw attention to that moment. And I think one of the lessons for today is that today we overthink a lot. Everyone wants to make change, but they've spent so much time strategizing on how to do. I know that if this battle stays here, it's going to cause havoc. And I'm just next to it, and I can just flip it behind me. But I want to look and see how, by moving this battle, how it's going to affect Yifat's mental health, and how is it going to affect the aesthetic of the room, and how is it going to affect the friendship around here, and all of the different things. Let me put it the way my colleague Tawaku Kama put it a few days ago when we were in New York at another event. Tawaku says, and we're talking about authoritarianism, and she said, those who are creating all of the chaos in our world, they don't stop to think. They don't stop to validate who's coming into their circle. If you walk in, they welcome you. Those of us who want to do good, on the other hand, we want to make sure that our values are aligned, our skin colors are aligned, our hair tone are aligned. And for the times that we live in, the more we overthink the strategy for change, the more grounds those who are committing evil, creating evil are gaining. And that's the lesson from Liberia. We never stopped to think who was paying attention. The day we wanted to issue a press statement, we had $10 in our handbag. We used that. Whatever the hell is going to happen tomorrow, did I cuss? We don't care. What we know is we've done what was necessary for today. And I think for the world that we live in, we should not, and most times what we want to do is good, but we overthink good. You know, if I approach this person who's struggling to take their baby in the carriage from down the subway to up to the street, are they going to judge me? Don't overthink good. It's either no thank you or get the hell away from me. But in any case, you've tried and you've given someone a reason to believe in humanity.
Yeah, thank you. Leymah, you said something that I have heard women across contexts and cultures and communities all around this world say about when you said, we did what was necessary for today. You know, and I think that is a kind of like a hallmark of women's organizing everywhere that you go. And you also were saying that something else that I think is really instructive for us right now, that the strategy that we use today may not be the strategy of tomorrow, right? And it's something that I'm thinking about a lot, looking at what's happening in so many of the communities where MADRE works around the world, and where we have a version of what many of our partners are facing, which is a backlash in this country against the gains of progressive social movements, an erosion of democracy, and a rise of authoritarianism, as you were mentioning, right? And so we have this challenge, right, where we have to be able to be in the immediacy of the moment and to act and to defend what we know, the people and the values that need to be defended. And we have to be nimble enough to change course when it's time to change course. And I think that one of the best ways that we have for exercising that judgment is each other. Because we know, and those of you who are studying these things can say this much more technically and eloquently with all kinds of stats, but we know, right, that when people make decisions in diverse groups, they come out with better decisions. And so I think that is like one of the lessons also for our organizing for today.
But Yifat, I also feel like in terms of the work that you do with MADRE and over the years that we've interacted, I think that is the beauty of one of the reasons why I partner with you all, because there is always this thing of allowing those outside of to be in their moment, to create in their moment. The world that we live in today, especially where partners are concerned, most times they want to import their ideology on the groups that are having their moment. And most times we miss moments of really critical change when we try to impose ideas. And I think that's one of the good things about MADRE, and I thought to just highlight that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that it's funny because sometimes people will make the assumption that the programming that we do is something that we develop, you know, here in New York at our office or in my laptop in my kitchen. And it always strikes me as kind of funny because that would be totally impossible for me to do, because I'm not living those experiences and I'm not in that community and I don't have the wisdom that comes from that lived experience, right? And I'll give you all just like one example. It's something from a long time ago, actually, but after the tsunami that happened in South Asia years ago at this point, I remember being in a conversation in the aftermath of that huge environmental disaster with a group of women in a community that was affected about what it was that they needed most in that moment. And what they said was limes. And these were people who had lost everything. They had lost their homes, they had lost their livestock, they had lost children in this catastrophe. Their entire community was devastated, and that was the one thing. It took them no time at all to say what they needed, and that was what they needed. And I asked them why, and they proceeded to explain that they found themselves living in a displacement camp with children and their husbands who were all completely traumatized. Their children were having nightmares. Their husbands were on a very short fuse. And we all know that in every community in the world where there is that kind of disruption and trauma, we see a rise in domestic violence. People always say, oh, well, in my community, we have domestic violence. It's in every community. Right? It's also here in New Jersey after Hurricane Sandy, there was a rise in domestic violence. So we understand that that is a universal part of gender imbalances of power. So these women were facing violence as well. And what they said to me was that they needed limes because that was the flavor of home. That was the thing that would make their food taste right for their kids and their husbands. And until the food tasted right, like it was supposed to, like home, nobody could feel a sense of normalcy, a sense of hope, a sense of possibility. So that was their most important thing in that moment. And needless to say, if I had been like sitting around with, a bunch of other quote unquote experts on women's rights and human rights in New York City, that is not the answer we would have come up with in that moment. So I think that it's as valuable as it is to have, like you were saying, degrees in strategic planning or whatever, and certainly the kinds of wisdom and the kinds of knowledge that we can develop in institutions like this one are critically important and can make an incredible contribution to the families and communities that I work with, that Leymah works with, and we have to remember that the expertise that we have is one piece of the puzzle. It's one thing to contribute. And that the people who are living that experience have their own, not just experience, but expertise that that we also need to take into account and work with. Leymah, I want to fast forward a little bit in terms of your work, because you are now the founder and executive director of the Institute for Gender, Law, and Transformative Peace at the City University of New York, which I'm very proud to serve as a board member on. And I wanted to ask you to share a little bit about the Institute and like what you're hoping to accomplish with it.
Thank you, Yifat. I've always been a dreamer, and sometimes I get in trouble for dreaming too much. And the Institute was one of those things that it started from my past life in Liberia. When we did our protest and everything, there were many people who came to interview us, as always, in communities, especially we're sitting in an academic space. People will come and they want to do their research. Oh, there were these group of women who did this and did that and did this, and there was one research after the other, more questions than answers. But what I recognized primarily in those days was that we weren't being interviewed as experts in our space. We were subjects. We were just women who did. And these people from the academic world were coming to validate our work through their academic writing. And I feel like it was wrong. I felt like, and I still feel that way, that there's absolutely no way I can come from Liberia, walk into Rutgers, talk to a few individuals, write a document, and just list all of those that I've written about as subjects of my research. I feel like it would be that these were the experts that I spoke to, and so when we started thinking through, Michaela, my thought partner, is here. When we started thinking through the Institute, it was thinking about how can we center the voices of grassroots women in the academic space as experts of what they do, not as subjects. How can we get them to partner with students? And we've seen so many examples of how young students have left universities and some of their theory of change, and I'm not talking about you, or maybe yours is better, but some people, their theory of change is upside down. They walk into a world that is upright and their theory of change is upside down. They do not even understand. So how do we bring these young people who tomorrow will be policymakers in DC to really understand what is happening on the ground? That's the first thing. The other thing is, really and truly, we were hoping that at the end of the day, some of our research will be, or some of the writings of these women will be in these spaces. So there are so many things that we hope to do, from centering the voices of these grassroots women to really working with students around policy issues in the grassroots spaces, but also letting the world know. And I think for me, that's key. Michaela may have something else, but key for me is that we are experts on the ground. And we are not subjects, and we should be treated as such. So coming to CUNY Law, we've seen really amazing work, but also using the space of the expertise, not just of women at the grassroots level, but our connections to start conversations like the conversation we had in September around the General Assembly to say, let's talk about some of the hard to talk about issues. Not many people want to talk about authoritarianism in today's world. Everyone is so afraid of getting their institution locked in or shut down or everything. So we create that space. The one thing I can say is what could happen. Don't come back here again. Thank God for Zoom. We'll still have those conversations on Zoom. So the whole idea of the Institute is to be a space for disruption and within the academic field. Let's talk about the things that no one wants to talk about. Let's bring those individuals who no one wants to bring into a room, and let's have serious conversations. So I really love the fact that we're doing what we're doing. I like the fact that we're partnering with you all. I like the fact that it is not just limited to Africa. We're doing Latin America, South America, all of these different places, but also that young people get to see, that this work is not just limited to the textbooks and their professors, which I have a lot of respect for, but that there are women on the ground who can also teach. One of my favorite part about the work that we do with the Institute is how we go into different communities and we do import facilitators. So for example, if we're doing work in Kenya or in Liberia or Ghana, all of our facilitators will be experts from on the continent. And I think this is a moment, it's revolutionary, that we are changing the way people do these things, because most times I tell Michaela we cannot go and bring someone from North America to come and stand in West Africa to talk about these things when we have Abina Busia and BC Adele, Fayemi, like really great women on the continent, and say we're bringing people. So we're changing the narrative around all of that. Am I a dreamer to think that in 5 years, the academic space will accept some of the things that we're doing? I don't think so. But I think just attempting to do that is revolutionary. And that's what I like about what we do at the Institute. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I encourage folks to check it out. It's called the Institute for Gender Law and Transformative Peace at the City University of New York Law School. And as Leymah is describing, some very interesting and new work coming out of that space. And I think it's one of the opportunities that we have right now that that we didn't have a few generations ago. And this is true in academia. It's also true in government. It's true in the private sector and in a lot of the advocacy spaces where we find ourselves. There are a lot of obstacles to bringing a human rights and a women's rights perspective into centers of power like the ones I just named. And it's very easy, I think, especially when we feel like we ourselves don't have enough power, to be focused on like all of those barriers. But we also have something that, a generation or two ago people didn't have, which is people in those centers of power who identify as being feminists, who care about the issues that we care about. And yes, they have to navigate the different kinds of institutional and political constraints in those settings. That's a real thing, right? But there also is, I think, capacity for a kind of insider-outsider strategy in some contexts, and a kind of like shared priority building, like what you're doing in academia, that is really like ours to build on, and important to notice that we have that, because it's easy, I think, to just focus on they don't listen to us, they don't take us seriously, and that's still an issue, right? It's not that doesn't exist, but not to squander like what we do have, because people fought really hard to make it into those spaces. So let's put them to work for us.
But I also think, Yifat, one of the things that I love about the space that we've created at the Institute is just the comfort that it gives to the activists coming into that space. Because I know initially when we started this work, I would sweat just thinking about me. And this is with the Nobel Peace Prize, being in an academic space. There were moments that I didn't feel credentialed enough to be doing the kind of work, but over the years, I've come to recognize that, yes, everyone has a level of expertise, and I bring something that others in this space, do not really have. I don't want to be an imposter. I don't want to be a professor. I just want the professors to understand that I too have something to contribute. And in a world where everyone is using the word intersectionality, which sometimes I'm resisting because I feel like we've made it so watered down, I think it is important for us to start thinking, what are the intersections of all of the work? And I think that's what we bring with, the Institute. How do we connect academia with grassroots, and grassroots with policy, and policy with politics, and all of the different things? Because then at the end of the day, because the times that we live in now is no longer a time for us to be working in silos. It's the time for us to really sit and think, how can we work together? I remember there was something you said recently, where in a conversation you said, was talking about the same exclusion of folks. And you said, when people go to some of these rallies of the far whatever group of people, as soon as you walk in and you say hi, they hand you a hat and they say, welcome, and what do you bring? And so there is no interrogation so they're just looking for a way to partner. So I think right now, those of us who think we want to do good, that's what the Institute is asking us to do. So come with all of the confidence or your insecurity, and at some point you will get secure, or you will find your niche. And I think, I really do think that's what the world is calling us for. And if anything, the Institute is for the times that we live in. Yeah.
Yeah. Reflecting as you're talking about what it is that prevents people from recognizing the expertise of people who are organizing in the community level, right? And it really boils down to discrimination, right? Discrimination against people who are poor, against people who've been denied the right to go to school, against people who, don't look or act or dress the way you do or we do or whatever. And it's so, and and it's easy, I think, to recognize the harm to the person who's being discriminated against, but it's also like it causes so much kind of like deficit to the people who are doing the discriminating, because they don't have the value of that person's expertise. And I was reflecting the other day with somebody on like how much energy we have to put in to overcoming the sorts of barriers that the women we work with face that are born of discrimination. And people who are like formidable organizers, powerful people in their communities, extremely wise about both the problems in their communities, can diagnose it very effectively, and have a clear understanding of what the solutions are. What they don't have is the power to implement those solutions because they have been denied the right to go to school or access to spaces where decisions are being made about their communities, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, when we first started working in Guatemala with a group of indigenous women, they formed an organization. These were women who were survivors of the genocide that the US backed by training and arming and funding right-wing militia forces in Nicaragua and Guatemala, I'm talking about here, although that happened in both of those countries. And these were women who were survivors of that genocide and were intent on finding people who had disappeared, their own family members, their community members, healing their communities, and rebuilding in the wake of this terrible systemic violence. They were powerful women. They formed an organization and asked us to help them with some funding, which we did. And they were not allowed to open a bank account. They went to Guatemala City, which was about a 2-hour ride from their community, so accessible. And the people at the bank literally wouldn't let them in the building to open a bank account because they were in indigenous dress. And to those people at the bank, it's like, well, what business could an indigenous, quote unquote, peasant possibly have in a bank in the downtown of the city? And we had to, and they tried and tried and tried again, and we actually had to put someone on an airplane from New York City and send her to Guatemala to physically accompany these women so that they would be allowed into the bank to open this bank account. So, and I remember the amount of rage and frustration when it was clear that that's what needed to happen, and that did happen, and they did open the bank account, and the young woman who from that community who went to open the bank account has since gone to law school, become the first indigenous woman lawyer in her community, was part of prosecuting the first ever crime of femicide in Guatemala. And that community of indigenous women is now credited with essentially saving Guatemalan democracy in the last couple of years after an attempt at democratic erosion that was overcome through the leadership of indigenous movements, and in particular, indigenous women. But to think that like they face that kind of barrier to their, just to doing sort of this back end work of opening a bank account, which you need to finance the work that you're doing.
Yifat, I think it's, for me, is I can swallow the ignorance of people who are not part of the change work when they do that. So those individuals in the bank are not part of any movement. They don't understand what these women bring. But what I can swallow are the ones who come to create change and have no understanding of the power, and they bring that mindset of discrimination. A few years back, we got some funds from one of the UN agencies. And in this community, there was a huge, real high rate of rape. I mean, bad, from 9-month-old babies, like no one was safe. So they came and said, can you help us? But they already came from New York with how they saw this problem being solved. And the way they wanted it to be solved was that the women should go from house to house and create awareness. So for them, awareness raising would end the rape in the community. So we go to sit with these women. They said, we don't want to create awareness. Say, we've been creating awareness for 2 years. We want to make cassava and rice farm. And we said, okay. And we want you all to give us the rice milling machine. And we want you all to give us the cassava fixing machine. So we did that. After a year, we got the experts from New York to come and do their evaluation of the work. And when they came, he said, oh, the women started a cassava farm. Oh my God, this is not an economic empowerment project. This is a project for creating awareness on sexual and gender-based violence. And so we said, okay, let's let these women school you, because even a 6-year-old can tell you the correlation between economic empowerment and rape and abuse. And so these women who have never sat in classroom sat them down and said, listen, when we made the rice farm and we bought the rice mill with the funds we got, we were able to sell rice and open a bank account. Every case of rape in our community, we went to the police and we could buy fuel for their motorbike to arrest the perpetrator. We could take the patient, the victim or the survivor to the doctor and ascertain that they were raped. Then we could hire a lawyer in our community to prosecute. Over the last year, cases of rape have dropped down to almost 80% in our community because we have the economic means to prosecute perpetrators of rape. And then they sit there looking with their mouths open. But that is the annoying part, because we need to begin to, and coming back to the Institute, these are some of the things that we want to put out there, that the answer for all of the problems we see in this community lies in the community. We should not even begin to think that it's out there. So from Guatemala to Liberia, Liberia to Nigeria, Ghana, even here in some of the communities in the US, the discrimination, especially when it's women, is more than any other thing, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that, for those of us who are not living and coming from the communities where we're working, right? If someone's studying public health and then hoping to go work in some of these communities, there is I think a sort of like an underappreciated skill that is really, really important and can remedy so much of what you're describing in the dysfunction of that kind of anecdote, which is just the skill of like deep listening, right? And it needs to be accompanied by humility and an understanding of the knowledge and the wisdom that people hold. But I think there's also a practice that we don't always learn when we're learning technical and academic information of what it is to like really, really listen and put aside I think I know what the solution is here. And maybe the solution that you came with to begin with is the right thing. That's not impossible. And the knowledge that that we can learn in an academic setting outside of a community does have its value and its application. But it really needs to be paired, I think, with the kind of humility and listening that was so absent in that terrible story that you just told. I want to ask you a little bit about talk about what's happening right now in the aftermath of the dismantlement of USAID in so many of the communities that both of us work with, and not just US foreign aid, but the whole international architecture of foreign assistance really has collapsed in the last couple of years, with European countries, who are the other major contributors, diverting foreign aid to remilitarization of those communities. And then, of course, the Trump administration in January very abruptly and very harmfully just destroying that whole system. I'm wondering, want to hear whatever you have to say, but also I wanted to ask you specifically, Leymah, what are you seeing in the communities where you work about, what are women doing? How are they responding to that crisis? Because it is very acute.
Let me say something, Yifat. In most of the communities that we work in, the work that these women do at the grassroots level is not tied to funding. It is their life. It is their lifeline. It's their insurance policy. What funding does for them, it makes it a bit easier. But with or without funding, they still have to wake up in the morning and do some of the things that they do. They still have to wake up in the morning and go from community to community, whether it's to create awareness about girls' education or to create awareness about harmful practices, because they know that without this kind of intervention, their community will not thrive. But what we're also seeing now is that there are so many national-based organizations, so organizations that are working in the capital city, pairing themselves up with organizations that are working in rural communities. So there's this kind of partnership that is happening, where you see one group who probably has $50,000 to do small work, going into communities and looking for women's organizations that are doing similar work, and they're saying to them, let's partner, let's help you do what we can do, but also let's teach you on how to raise money from local means or other things, but it's not stopping. Several years ago, I was in Congo, way before all of this, and Julienne Lusenge, who is Sofapadi and Fund for Congolese Women, she has something called Fund for Congolese Women. And as we're in Congo, Julienne will go from place to place to place, like collecting from $100 to $50 to $75, sometimes $10 from people. And she's putting it in this fund. And she's saying to me, this is how we raise money for these women to do the kind of work that they're doing in the community. And in those communities, they were not even just serving the needs of women. Men who were being sexually assaulted were being helped by these women. What they were doing was asking people who had clinics to give them one room. And in that one room, they will buy their own medication, have their own physician assistants sit there and cater to some of the needs that the clinic could not cater to. And we see more of those things happening today in many communities. I think when USAID folded, it was also a moment that turned into a movement, because now we're seeing that. I'll give an example. Our Liberian government depended on US aid for $250,000 to distribute medication in rural communities. $250,000. This is a country that is rich in diamond, gold, rubber, timber, iron ore. We hold 43% of the forest reserve within the Mano River Basin. That is cash. But we still depended on the US government for $250,000 to distribute drugs in rural communities. The moment that money was cut off, we started mobilizing small organizations to go back to the Health Committee of Senate to say, the government must do this. Today, they included that in the budget, that they will handle it. So there's a lot of advocacy. So out of bad can come some good, and even though it's not where we want to see it, but I think I have two minds with the folding of US aid. It's time for African governments to stand up. Some of the funds that we're receiving in our countries, for example, the US government gave $25 million every year to Liberia for maternal health. But this $25 million, no one knows where it goes to, because we're still seeing women giving birth and they're being incarcerated in the hospitals because they can't pay. And not private hospitals, government hospitals. So all of these monies, some of it, yes, they were going to the right place, but others were not going to the right place. Recently in LA, Nicola Christoph was talking about a clinic in South Sudan, way out in the forest, that was built by US aid money, $1 million a year. And when they cut funding, people were crying. Have you been to Juba? Have you seen the cars that the officials ride? The latest model of different SUVs parked Range Rover, they have a thing for Range Rover in South Sudan. So imagine if you're taking 20 of those Range Rovers and saying we will not buy these and we'll put it into maternal health issue. So even as we're upset that in some places medications are being spoiled, destroyed, and everything, but this is a moment for us to turn it into a movement to challenge some of our governments in Africa to say, do good by your people. Spend some of the money, and activists in most of these communities are not doing it. But again, with or without US aid money, and you know, Yifat, that many of these organizations were saying to staff, let's rotate. People were saying, I would take salary cut. I am blessed to be one of those that Melinda asked to give out $20 million. So over the last few months, we've had a tedious task of giving money to organizations and having women call to say, thank you. Without this 25,000, we're going to fold. Without this 10,000, we're not going to be able to do some of the work that we're doing. So people are rearranging, realigning, doing all of the reading for their budgets, but they are not giving up because the moment that we find ourselves in is not a moment to give up, with or without cash. I always tell people we started the movement in Liberia with $10 US from someone's handbag. When we didn't have money for water, we fasted. When we didn't have money for transportation, we walked. When we didn't have money for hotel, we slept in one room. So when the movement calls for paying for adjustment, you have to adjust. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if other people have seen this statistic from UN Women, but they came out with a report about 4 months ago. So about 6 months after the USAID big cuts happened in January, saying that more than half of all women's organizations in crisis settings in the world were in danger of being shut down because of the dynamics that you're describing. So the harm is real, and it's sometimes like can really like just stretch our capacity to hold two contradictory things at once, right? Which is like a really important skill to have for moments like this, but it is hard to do. To really account for the amount of harm and human suffering that was caused by those decisions, the callousness of that policy, and the real destruction that we're seeing in lives and health all around the world. And at the same time, the sense of possibility that emerges from that collapse, right? Like you're saying, Leymah, of what if this is an opportunity to actually hold our own governments accountable? Because actually, it is not the job of these little women's organizations to ensure maternal health. That is the job of everybody's government. And many of our governments, certainly our government right now, but even past US administrations, have abdicated that right. I mean, that obligation to everybody's social and economic rights, maternal health included. So I think that we need to do a few things at once, right? One is to kind of like celebrate and support the capacity of organizations that are saying, USAID is gone, we're gonna step in. We're gonna partner with this little local group out in the countryside and make this happen. That is excellent and important to support. We're gonna hold our government to account. That work needs to be supported. But we need to be able to pair the kind of micro of people at the local level doing that with the sort of macro level conditionalities that are shaping the circumstances that everybody's operating in. Because why are governments in Africa not investing in their people's public health? You illustrated the issue of corruption, right? So that's real in many parts of the world. And so is the economic realities that those countries have been in since independence from colonization, which is a kind of a forced policy agenda forced by the Washington Consensus and by lenders in Europe that prevents governments from investing in public health and infrastructure and job training and other things for their own people, and has made them dependent on things like foreign assistance from Europe or USAID in the case of the United States. So all of that was like a system that was intentionally put into place. So there is both, I think, like danger and opportunity for us in this moment as that system is collapsing. And one of the things that we're seeing a lot of is new conversations about what it's going to take to finance the kind of local community work that most women do, right? Most women in the world organize at the local level, like right outside their house, basically. And there's a tremendous amount of benefit in terms of health and education and agriculture and climate stabilization and all kinds of benefits to the society from women getting together at the local level and organizing for those things. But there is a very real question about financing that work. Like you were saying, you didn't have money to fill a gas tank, you have to walk. And so there is a trend right now that I think is a very positive one emerging from this pretty bleak moment of people thinking and rethinking about what it means to finance work outside of government aid, outside of philanthropy, at least the kind of private philanthropy that flows in large dollar amounts from the global north to the global south, which is what many of us think of as philanthropy, right? And so people are both excavating models of organizing and financing work that everybody relied on before we built up this giant nonprofit industrial complex in the US and foreign aid architecture all around the world, right? People have always organized with and for their communities. People have always organized to end their own oppressions in different ways. So that part is not new. And that part will continue because people are people and they are resilient and they are determined to live with freedom and dignity no matter where they are. So the organizing will continue. The question of how we finance the organizing needs to shift right now. But there is a lot of, I think, interest not just in looking at old models and what we might be able to dust off and repurpose for today. Things like African women's revolving loan funds, which as far as we know have always existed. And in many places also today do the work that social safety nets that are in other places government entitlements provide to people. So, people asking really interesting questions about what would it look like to scale something like a revolving loan funds that women use at the local level. Because those actually are extremely scalable. That's essentially what a savings and loan bank is that could serve thousands of people, right? This isn't going to be a very technical description, but it's essentially people taking turns using money. So that is definitely possible to scale. And there's a lot of interest, I think, not just on the continent, but also in other places in the Caribbean where that came from Africa and is a very embedded tradition. Looking at things like self-funded movements, like the labor movement in this country, which is, sort of a dues model that also people are using in other places. What you described Julienne doing of like local philanthropy. And thinking about like changing also the modalities of some of the organizing. Like maybe we don't need to have these giant national and international organizations. Maybe we need to have small local organizations that we can replicate and that can learn from each other and that are scalable through multiplicity rather than size. So I think there's like a lot of like innovative thinking happening right now that interestingly might not be happening if we weren't in the crisis that we're in, and is arguably the only good part of what is otherwise, as I said, like a very cruel and callous policy. So that to me is kind of like a sign of hope.
But Yifat, I have a question. And that question is, in as much as we're all upset and with USAID, the cut and everything, I mean, how much of that money do you think went down to local grassroots organization? The really, really poor groups, the ones that Julienne, how much of that money went to those group of people?
Yeah. So I will answer that question anecdotally because I don't have a figure for you, but I will say I know Julienne, and I know that she has never gotten that kind of a grant, and neither have almost any of the other grassroots organizations that we work with or that anybody works with, because that money is not designed to be accessible to folks who are organizing at the local level.
I've never gotten any.
No. No, and you need to have like an entire person who is professionally trained to manage grants like that. You need to have all kinds of, logarithms and other kinds of things that regular people don't have, and that honestly have almost nothing to do with creating social change. But that is part of the giant edifice that has been created. But you know what is the case, even though the groups that we work with, they don't get that money because they've never been eligible for that money because it's not designed for them. That is true. But it's also true that they live in communities where the systems that they depend on were reliant on that money. So like the schools and the clinics and the water treatment facilities that people do very much rely on, the childhood vaccination programs, that kind of public health infrastructure that people do need and rely on came from, in many ways, that money. Not through grassroots groups, though.
But one of the things that I love about the moment that we find ourselves in is how, and we talked about it earlier, communities are shifting. And in people are, there is a revolution, for a lack of a better word, happening, especially in my space, in spaces that I live in on the continent. People are no longer sitting and waiting. Women are no longer sitting and waiting. They're taking charge. They're moving forward. They're doing stuff. As hard as it is, I think we're going back to movement building from the past. And when I talk about movement building from the past, when Jean Addams and all of those women were using their own money to go to The Hague, this is where we're seeing ourselves again, because women are using the little resources that they have in refugee camps. You have them doing soup, giving soup. In Congo, when we talk about rape and abuse, the women will say we come together and we go to the hospital and we put together what we have to assist someone who has just gotten out of the hospital so that they have a life. And then where there is no mental health facility, we assign one person to keep talking to this person, praying with them, their own kind of trauma healing, they're doing it. So I feel like every moment, back to the theme of the night, every moment presents an opportunity for a movement, regardless of how bad it may be. And US aid, no money, Liberia, civil war, all of the different things, there are opportunities that we cannot afford to miss. And I think that's where I want to speak to the young people in the room, that it's not all gloom and doom. It's never all gloom and doom. There is always a ray. And if you can see a ray of light, then it's an opportunity for you to try to poke further to see if you can make it bigger. But there are always opportunities in the midst of hardship. Today, in the absence of all of these US aid and all of the different things, other groups are stepping up, giving little bits of money. But again, the ingenuity of women, they're using it, innovation, all of the different things. So I feel like I don't want to be stuck there in the moment. I want to progress to where change happens, how we're making change, how you are making change. You're not stuck. You've lost considerable amount of funding. I'm still struggling for funding, but it doesn't stop what we're doing, because we know that the world, the young people, and a lot of others depend on what we do. So we can't stop. We can't allow the politics of our time to determine how we shape the future of the world that we live in. So for me, when people start to talk about this movement, I tell people I've never had, really and truly, until Melinda gave me that money to give out, I had never had an organization give me $1 million to say, for my work in Liberia to say, take this and do your work. But that has never stopped me from doing the work. A few years ago, we started the foundation to send young people to school. We started with 12. Today, we have 500 and something. But even, so I tell my people when they say, oh, you know the donors regulation, the donors say, I say, please, even before the donors came, we were doing this work. We're raising money locally, we're raising money, and we're sending young people to school. So I don't want us to, young people in the room and to everyone else, let's not be stuck in a place where we're still thinking, oh, the Trump administration, this is a rare opportunity for some of you to put your crazy ideas out there and start doing something that will transform either your community, your school, or this nation. Who knows? But we can't be stuck here, Yifat. We can't. I resist this. Resisting this moment is another form of revolution. So I resist the fact that people will continue to say, oh, and the times that we find ourselves. Someone said, eventually people will adjust. If there's no one to carry the trash, they will learn how to dispose of their trash with our help. Because we're a unique group of people. No one says we should roll over and not fight authoritarianism. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying whilst we're fighting, we can still use what we have to make a difference.
Thank you for an absolutely incredible conversation. I just want to give Leymah and Yifat another round of applause, really. Thank you so much. And thank you for that message of hope and resistance, both together. I want to open for a couple questions. We only have a few minutes, but I just want to make sure I know that we have students who have some questions for the two of you, but I'd like to open for some questions. If you want to come line up in front of the microphone, if you have a question you'd like to ask. And if you can, introduce yourself, your name, your current year, and what you're studying.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it definitely gave me a lot to think about as a second-year student entering the world, like career-wise. Towards the end of the conversation, we started talking about funding, and it got me thinking, and I couldn't help to think about how there's a lot of global funding being poured into AI and this big tech race. And so I started to think about if there was any concern on efforts of grassroots being overshadowed or the wealth gap being widened with a lot of global funding being poured into AI, and maybe what ways that we can combat this and kind of emphasize grassroots efforts.
The answer is yes. Yeah, I mean, I think that is a concern, but I think that I don't think it's the case, unfortunately, that the money that's being poured into AI, if it wasn't going to AI, it would be getting poured into Leymah's work, which is where we want it to go, right? And so I think what you're speaking to is like a broader problem about like where our priorities are, like as a society, as a global community. And certainly there are, whether we're talking about AI or weapon systems or just the extreme like hoarding, frankly, of private wealth that we see so, blatantly in this country. All of those things, I think, are working at cross purposes with like our vision of the kind of world that we want to have, right? Which is one where everybody has what they need to thrive, and people and the planet are protected. So, I think you're raising one of several issues that we will need to address and work to redirect some of the resources that are being poured into that, for certain.
Definitely, thank you.
Hello, my name is Samantha. I'm a junior here at Rutgers. I'm studying physics and Spanish and English translation. And firstly, I want to say thank you for taking the time to be here and share about your experiences. I think it's caused a really interesting conversation, I know, for some of the classes that I'm in. And I had a question based on the 2024 Sustainable Development Goals Gender Index, where they state that not one country is on track to achieve gender equality by 2030. And I was wondering if each of you could maybe provide some insight onto what political or social trends you think may have led to this recent stagnation in the fight for gender equality.
All right, well, I'll start because that could be a long conversation, right? But I will say one thing, which is that there is a clear correlation between women's rights and democratic rights, every place in the world, always. And we are in a moment in the world where we are seeing democratic backsliding, not just here in this country, but actually in every region. And I think it's the case that about 2/3 of the global population at this point are living under authoritarianism. And that number has been rising steadily over the past decade and a half, I would say. So that's a real concern. And it also, and the flip side of that is that women's rights are a real hope, not just for women and girls and for all people, but also for democracy. There is no successful democracy movement in the world that doesn't center women's rights. And that's because those are really two sides of the same coin. So that's, I think, an important thing to watch as those things trend together.
Yifat, what Yifat said is so right. In our side of the world, we still, and I'm talking about Africa, we really did not think that by 2030 we'll get there, because we're way behind. Even when the SDGs were being formed, we're asking ourselves questions like, how possible is this? How can we even come close to some of these issues when we're still struggling with issues of FGM and all of the different things? But one of the things I would like to say is that from maybe 15 years ago, the trend started, and it didn't start with with democracy. It started with the whole conversation around women's bodies. I don't know if you all remember that. I would say maybe from 2005, 2010, at the UN, there was this real resistance on conversation around reproductive health and rights. And I think that was the moment when it started, and no one was paying attention. No one wanted to hear about family planning, because those ignorant people sitting in there were saying family planning was equated to LGBTQ rights, and no one wanted to talk about it at the time. So in those moments, things were being taken away from women slowly, and no one was paying attention to it. And so I feel like if we are to track leadership, gender equality, we must track communities where women's reproductive health and rights are prioritized or taken away. And I think maybe from 2005 until today, that's when we started losing it. Are we going to gain it? I don't think so, not now. But are we sitting down and doing nothing? I would say no. We continue to work, except that earlier on, the young women interviewing me asked the question, and I feel like we are exhausted. There's a lot of exhaustion within the women's rights movement, the gender equality movement, because we have competing priorities that we just don't know how to navigate. I know I'm tired. I'm tired having to fight in rooms to talk about things that is good for the world, and people are just stuck in one place. We know that when women do well, communities do well, but no one is paying attention to those things. I think the fire with which Auntie Abina and co went to Beijing, with the fire has dimmed in the women's movement across the world, because we're fighting a lot of demons. And it's not like we're just fighting. As you're fighting, there are waves of things that are coming and hitting us from every side. I think we need to sit and rethink and just galvanize our energy. I don't know about the women in the US, but personally, there are days that I just don't want to tackle anything on feminism or women's rights because it's exhausting. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
My name is Suhani, and I'm studying finance and math, and I'm a junior. So my question is, in our own lives, we're often told to be resilient or adapt rather than question the systems that make things harder for women. What steps can we take as students and young professionals to challenge those systems even before we hold leadership positions?
Well, I'm not sure if I'm going to answer your question, but I'll just say that I reached a point where I got so sick of hearing the word resilience. And so I really appreciate you framing your question the way that you did, because I do think that that word became kind of code for suck it up. And especially and applied in specifically in like very racist ways, right? Of romanticizing, for example, Black women's resilience. And so I always at this point feel very suspect when I hear that kind of language of like, oh, she's so resilient. It's like people should not have to be nearly as resilient as they are forced to be. And so I do think that what we need to do, and I'm not sure I can answer your question from the point of view of like what you can do as a student, because I'm not a student, but I will say that whatever we're doing with our time, whether we're in the workforce or students or have the privilege as we do to do kind of social change work like as our day jobs, right? Not everybody gets to do that, but everybody does get to be part of social change through organizing. And so I just would really encourage you to find other people and people who share your frustration and people who share your vision of like how you want your life to be, and to organize with them. And what that organizing looks like, we don't know. But you know what you were just saying, Leymah, about the exhaustion, like that's real. And the crisis that we find ourselves in this country and in the world is not gonna dissipate anytime really soon. And so that means, among other things, we kind of have to be able to pace ourselves, and we have to be able to rely on each other. So if you have a day where all you can do is lie on your couch and watch Netflix, that's what you need to do that day. You know what I mean? And then the rest of us need to kind of take up that energy so that Leymah can rest, and then she'll be back, twice as strong because she's rested. But we all need to be able to do that for each other, because this is like a long-term thing. And it really is, and back to remembering Anita and how she used her life, this is for all of us, like part of our life's work.
Thank you so much for your time.
We have time for one more question. Sorry, just one.
Sorry. Okay, my name is Shanae. I'm an Africana Studies major, and I feel like I took a lot from this conversation, so thank you so much for coming. My question was regarding your TED Talk, actually, Yifat. You're talking about thinking like a mother, and I find in a lot of aspects, mothers are the leaders of families and households, and I've spent my life watching my mother work towards the success of her family at the expense of herself. And so I was wondering, in terms of women leadership and motherhood, how do we think of leadership in a way that's less self-sacrificial? Sorry. And this can be to both of you.
Women's leadership and motherhood less sacrificial? Just die. Die, my guy, just die, finish. There is absolutely no way, even without the motherhood and leadership and anything, life within itself is sacrificial. I have 8 children, and I tell people that I didn't have the pleasure of seeing my son play soccer until he was in his final year of high school. I am one of those who resist the narrative of we can have it all. Is a lie. We can never have it all, because you can't be at one place at 2 places at the same time. But in terms of leadership, it's give and take. It's fighting, is putting out there. So sacrifice is something that is all part of life, and don't let anyone, just being here in this moment, we've sacrificed something in our lives. I'm running out of the door because my daughter is 11th grade and this is parents' college night at her school. So from here, I have to go there, but being here, it is a sacrifice. So please don't buy into that narrative. But the one thing, Yifat said something just now, that in that moment where you want to lie on your couch, do it. Because sometimes the way life is, especially for us who are social activists, is that if you don't show up, everything will stop, is another lie. You know, I had a staff, I always work with a group of young people. We had this staff who was very sick, but she kept coming to work. And one of the days, the young women went to her and said, Adama, what do you want to prove? Working for this feminist organization, you're sick and you won't stay home? Let me tell you something, one of the girls. If you die, all you will get in this feminist gathering is let's have a moment of silence for Adama. And there will be no moment of silence because someone's cell phone will ring. So it's you prioritizing, you being intentional. And that's what I learned during the pandemic, that I want to be intentional about what I do. Spend my energy to where I feel like. Don't run around like a headless cock and just, so yes, you will sacrifice, but sacrifice intentionally. You know, and those things that they teach us, that you have to sacrifice your life for, you do family, you do this, you do that, you do the other. No. Tell yourself in this, I just said I have 8 kids, and I just signed up to foster one more child. But I'm telling myself in a moment that I will do this, I will do that, I will do the other. There are certain things that I don't do. And so where is your boundary, even in the midst of sacrificing? I think that's the point that I want to make. And to you about the voice on campus, the moment you silence yourself is the moment that you don't control your own life anymore. Speak up, even if it is painful. Don't be insulting, but let people know that this is my position, this is where I stand, and this is how I feel. I told myself, Leymah, the day you stop talking is the day you stop existing. And it's for each and every one of us in this room, especially to the young ladies. Don't stop talking. Speak up. Speak about your issue. If you're uncomfortable about something, say I'm uncomfortable. People will either adjust or they will never allow you in their space again. And I always say that to people. I'm here in the US on a visa. I will say what I have to say. They either tell me we can't renew your visa or we'll renew your visa. In any case, I have a nation to go back to. And if I can't travel, my president is in trouble, because then I will interrogate everything he does until he put me in prison. But don't stop talking.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Leymah and Yifat. Thank you to the students, to the audience members. Thank you to Anita's family and to all of you for joining us today. I think, following on your point, Leymah, this lecture is Anita's voice continuing to work in the world. We're educating and inspiring future leaders, and you both and all of you are shining examples of that. So thank you again.